20 of New York's top doctors filled the conference room. Yet not one could explain why Elliot Harrington, a billionaire tech mogul, was fading before their eyes. The December wind clawed at the hospital's tall windows, rattling them ever so slightly. Outside, the snow floated in lazy spirals before settling on the roofs of yellow cabs crawling along Madison Avenue. Inside Mount Sinai's conference room, the air was too warm, the fluorescent lights too white, and every face around the long table carried the same tight-lipped frustration. Dr. Richard Lang cleared his throat, his silver hair catching the light as he glanced at the man seated at the head of the table. "Mr. Harrington," he began, "measured your scans are clear. No tumors, no infections, but your vitals?" He hesitated, as though hoping the numbers might change. If he paused long enough, continued to decline. Rapidly. Elliot Harrington didn't flinch. His eyes, clear gray and almost metallic, rested on the neat stack of reports in front of him. Even now, in a charcoal wool suit and cashmere scarf tossed over the chair back, he carried the crisp, impenetrable look of a man who built empires out of code and steel. But his knuckles were pale, and his breath came just a little shorter than it should. "I see," he said simply, his voice quiet, but edged in a firmness that made two of the younger doctors drop their gaze. From the corner of the room, Monica Vance, his ever-present assistant, shifted her weight. Her blonde hair was pulled back into a tight bun, her tablet already open on the next appointment. She caught Dr. Lang's eye, her tone brisk. "We appreciate your time. We'll consult again tomorrow." They were already halfway through the usual goodbye ritual handshakes, murmured promises to review the data again, when the conference room door clicked open. Naomi Carter stepped in, balancing a silver tray with two steaming mugs. She wore a deep green sweater, the kind that looked soft enough to sink into, and black slacks. A few snowflakes still clung to her braids. "Excuse me," she said gently, her voice carrying a warmth that contrasted with the sterile chill of the room. "I brought something for—" Monica was on her, instantly blocking her path. "Naomi, this isn't your place. Please wait outside." Naomi glanced at Elliot, who hadn't moved, then back to Monica. Her hand tightened on the tray before she spoke softer, but more certain. "I think I can help him." It was such an odd statement in that room, surrounded by the city's most credentialed physicians, that it stopped conversation cold. Dr. Lang actually blinked as though unsure he'd heard correctly. A couple of the younger doctors exchanged bemused looks. One even gave a short, incredulous laugh. Monica's smile was tight and dismissive. "Thank you, Naomi, but we have specialists for this. You may leave." The tray wobbled slightly as Naomi stepped back. The spicy sweet scent of ginger and cinnamon drifted through the air, a small comfort fighting to be noticed against the sharp tang of antiseptic. She turned toward the door, her boots squeaking faintly on the polished floor. Through the narrow glass panes, snow was still falling thicker now, turning the city into a blur of white and yellow light. Elliot's gaze followed her, though he said nothing. His fingers tapped once quietly against the tabletop before he returned them to his lap. Out in the corridor, Naomi set the tray down on a small side table. She picked up one mug, the paper tag from the tea bag, Bigelow ginger and cinnamon dangling against the porcelain, and placed it carefully on a napkin. From her pocket, she drew a folded scrap of paper and wrote in looping script, "For strength," from someone who's seen this before. She adjusted it beside the mug, took a breath, and walked toward the elevator without looking back. The hum of voices in the conference room faded as the door closed behind Naomi. Dr. Lang gathered the remaining files, stacking them with a precision that hinted at his unease. Elliot remained seated, his hands clasped loosely, eyes distant. He had seen countless meetings like this over the years, boardrooms, investor summits, negotiations that decided the fate of entire companies. Yet none had carried the same slow, suffocating weight as this one. Monica leaned toward him. "We should head home. You have another appointment this afternoon with the nutritionist. Maybe—" He raised a hand, silencing her. "Cancel it." "But Elliot," I said, "cancel it." His voice wasn't loud, but it carried the sort of authority that ended conversations. Monica pressed her lips together and tapped at her tablet, her nails clicking against the glass. They left the hospital together, stepping into a swirl of wind-driven snow. The doorman at the private entrance straightened the moment he saw Elliot. "Morning, Mr. Harrington," he said, pulling the glass door wide. Elliot gave a polite nod, adjusting his scarf as the cold bit at his cheeks. The city smelled faintly of exhaust and roasting chestnuts from a vendor on the corner. Monica hurried ahead to flag a cab, though Elliot was already stepping toward the waiting black SUV that had been idling at the curb. Inside the car, heat blasted from the vents, carrying the faint scent of leather upholstery. Monica busied herself with her phone, firing off emails, arranging appointments. Elliot sat back, watching the blur of the city pass by the snow, softening the hard lines of brownstones, muffling the usual chaos. At a red light, his eyes drifted to the passenger seat, where a plain white paper cup sat in a cardboard holder. His driver must have picked it up earlier, but the sight of it made him think of the mug Naomi had left behind. Her voice replayed in his mind, not loud, not pushy, just steady. "I think I can help him." It wasn't the kind of claim one made lightly, especially in a room full of experts. Yet there had been no arrogance in her tone, only certainty. They reached the Upper East Side penthouse, a sleek glass tower that reflected the muted winter sky. Inside the lobby was warm, decorated with a towering Christmas tree trimmed in gold and white. The scent of pine mixed with a faint trace of cinnamon from a candle burning at the concierge desk. Elliot bypassed the elevator's mirror walls without glancing at his own reflection. Upstairs, the penthouse greeted him with its usual pristine order-polished wood floors, the muted hum of the central heating floor-to-ceiling windows framing a postcard view of Central Park dusted in white. Monica followed him inside, setting her bag on the marble kitchen island. "You should rest for a bit," she said, already moving toward the study to sort through the mail. Elliot wandered toward the living area. On the coffee table sat a small tray, polished silver, with a single mug resting in the center. The steam curling above it carried the unmistakable scent of ginger and cinnamon. He stopped, his breath catching for a moment. He hadn't asked for this. It wasn't part of the rigid routine Monica kept. But he knew exactly who had placed it here. From somewhere down the hall, he could hear Monica's voice, faint but edged. She was on a call, her tone clipped, discussing a possible security breach at the hospital, Naomi's unannounced appearance, no doubt. Elliot reached for the mug, his fingers brushing against the folded scrap of paper tucked beneath it. The ink was deep blue, the handwriting elegant yet unpolished for strength. From someone who's seen this before. He turned the note over in his hand, as if expecting more, but it was blank on the other side. Setting it aside, he lifted the mug, feeling the heat seep into his palms. Through the glass walls, snow continued to drift across the park, blanketing the winding paths and frozen ponds. Somewhere far below, carolers were singing, faint, almost drowned by the hum of the city. The tea's aroma was stronger now, warming the air between him and the window. He thought of Naomi again, of the way she had stood her ground in that room without raising her voice. There was something disarming in her calm, a steadiness that made the laughter of the doctors feel shallow in hindsight. He brought the mug closer, the rim touching his lips. The liquid was hot, but not scalding, the spice blooming on his tongue. The warmth from the tea spread slowly down his throat, settling in his chest like a small fire against the winter chill that clung to him, despite the penthouse's steady heat. The ginger was sharp, cutting through the faint ache behind his eyes, while the cinnamon left a lingering sweetness on his tongue. He lowered himself onto the leather sofa, the mug still in his hands, elbows resting loosely on his knees. The snow beyond the windows swirled in lazy spirals. The world outside softened into shades of white and silver. In the kitchen, Monica's voice grew louder as she paced her heels, clicking against the tile. "Oh, I don't care what she said. She's a maid, not a doctor. This is a violation of—" She stopped abruptly, perhaps realizing Elliot could hear her. A moment later, her footsteps retreated down the hall. He wasn't in the mood to confront her. Right now, all he wanted was the quiet, the taste of something that didn't come from a sterile bottle or a prescription pad. He thought back to his mother's kitchen when he was a boy, the smell of simmering cider on December afternoons, the sound of her humming over the stove. He hadn't let himself think about those days in years. It occurred to him that Naomi's note, short, almost cryptic, was the first personal thing anyone had handed him in weeks. Not a report, not a diagnosis, not a bill, just a gesture, simple, uncalculated. He took another sip. The heat worked deeper now, relaxing something in his chest he hadn't even realized was tense. A faint prickling sensation began at the base of his neck, spreading over his shoulders, and he leaned back, eyes closing for a moment. Somewhere down in the street, a siren wailed, then faded. The caroler's song floated back in clearer this time, a slow, steady harmony of silent night threading through the muffled air. When he opened his eyes, the light in the room seemed softer, the edges of the furniture less sharp. His breathing evened out, though he wasn't sure if it was the tea or the stillness that caused it. His phone buzzed on the table. Monica's name flashed across the screen, but he ignored it. For now, he didn't want explanations or warnings. He just wanted to sit there and let the taste of ginger and cinnamon anchor him to something real. He lifted the mug again, holding it near his lips, watching the faint steam curl upward. He wondered against all reason if Naomi really had seen this before, as she'd written, seen what a sickness like his, or simply the weariness that came from too many unanswered questions. His mind replayed this moment she'd spoken in the hospital room. The way the doctor's expressions had shifted from mild surprise to polite dismissal, and how she hadn't flinched beneath their gaze. She'd been out of place, yes, but not out of her depth. Elliot glanced toward the folded note again on the tray, tempted to read it one more time, as if a second look might reveal something he'd missed. But instead, he set the mug down gently and rubbed at his temple. A faint dampness touched his skin. At first he thought it was condensation from the mug, but when he lowered his hand, he saw it a thin bead of moisture sliding from his hairline down to the back of his hand. The room wasn't hot enough for this. A slow chill replaced the warmth in his chest, crawling down his spine. He stared at the mug, at the last tendrils of steam curling upward, and felt another drop form, rolling from his temple to his wrist. Snowflakes clung to Naomi's scarf as she let herself into the penthouse, only to find Elliot sitting in the dark, waiting. She paused just inside the door, shaking off the fine layer of snow from her shoulders. The only light came from the street lamps outside, casting long, pale shapes across the polished floor. Elliot was in the armchair by the window, his silhouette framed by the falling snow beyond the glass. "You're early," he said, his voice low but steady. "I wanted to check on you," Naomi replied, unwinding her scarf. "How are you feeling today?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees. "Yesterday at the hospital, you said you'd seen this before. What exactly did you mean?" Naomi set her bag down, slowly reading the intent in his eyes. He wasn't accusing her. He genuinely wanted to know. "I meant, I've seen people fade like that. My mother when she was fighting cancer, and before her, my grandmother who cared for folks the doctors couldn't help." "Folk remedies?" he asked, with a faint trace of skepticism. "Not magic," Naomi said, moving toward the kitchen. "Herbs, spices, warmth. Sometimes the body listens to kindness more than it does to medicine." Elliot almost smiled at that, but it vanished as quickly as it came. He followed her with his gaze as she reached for a pot, her movements confident and familiar. The sound of running water filled the quiet. Outside, the muted hum of the city seemed far away. The snow was still falling thicker now, blurring the outline of Central Park. Elliot's penthouse was warm, but the air carried a tension, something fragile, like the first crack in a frozen lake. "What are you making?" he asked after a while. "Chicken noodle soup," Naomi replied without turning, "the way my mother taught me. And cornbread, if you have the patience to wait." He glanced toward the dark laptop screen on the coffee table. "I have time." Naomi smiled faintly, then looked over her shoulder. "Then do me a favor. Don't sit there in the dark. Turn on a light, Mr. Harrington." He raised an eyebrow. "Elliot," he corrected. She nodded once and reached up to switch on the pendant lamp above the kitchen island. Warm light spilled across the marble counter, illuminating the bowls and cutting board she'd pulled from the cupboards. From the far side of the room, Monica's voice drifted in, clipped and polite. "Naomi, I wasn't aware you were scheduled for dinner service tonight." "I'm not," Naomi answered, keeping her tone even. "But someone needs a real meal." Monica's heels clicked closer. You know the boundaries of your position. Before Naomi could reply, Elliot's voice cut in. She's fine, Monica. Let her cook. There was a short, brittle silence before Monica stepped back into the hallway. Naomi began chopping carrots, the steady rhythm of the knife oddly soothing. She doesn't like me much, she murmured. She doesn't like anyone she hasn't vetted, Elliot said. It's her job. And yours, Naomi asked gently. My job, to let someone help you without questioning their motives. Elliot didn't answer. He watched as she moved around the kitchen with practiced ease, pulling stock from the fridge, sprinkling in dried thyme and a pinch of black pepper. The smell began to fill the air, rich savory, with the faint sweetness of onions softening in the pot. You ever spend much time outside the city? Naomi asked over her shoulder. Not lately, he replied. Why? Snow like this? It's different when you're not surrounded by skyscrapers. Feels quieter. Like the world's taking a breath. He considered that, his gaze shifting back to the snow-covered park. I used to spend Christmas at my family's place in Vermont, he said finally. Hasn't happened in years. You should go back someday, Naomi said. If only to remember what it feels like. For a moment neither spoke. The only sound was the gentle simmer of the soup and the occasional pop from the baseboard heater. Elliot exhaled almost imperceptibly. You said your grandmother cared for people like me. Did she ever succeed? Sometimes, Naomi replied. Sometimes not. But she always made sure they felt human again. Not like a chart in a folder. He looked down at his hands, the faint tremor still there, but not as pronounced as yesterday. And you think that matters? I think it's a start, she said simply. Naomi ladled a spoonful of the simmering broth, tasting it with a small nod. Almost there, she said, turning off the heat for a moment to let the flavors settle. The scent of garlic chicken and herbs drifted lazily through the penthouse, making the space feel less like a fortress and more like a home. Elliot had moved closer to the kitchen island, leaning against it, his arms crossed. The hard lines of his expression softened as he watched her work. I can't remember the last time I smelled something like this in here, he admitted. That's a shame, Naomi replied, pouring the soup into a large bowl. A home should smell like someone cares enough to feed you. He didn't answer right away, just followed her as she set the table. The dining area overlooked Central Park, its frozen expanse glistening under the glow of the street lamps. A dusting of snow clung to every tree branch, and tiny specks swirled in the wind, like glitter in a snow globe. Naomi placed a plate of golden cornbread on the table beside the steaming soup. She slid a chair back. Sit, she said gently. He hesitated. I'm not used to being told what to do in my own home. I'm not used to cooking for people who look like they haven't eaten a real meal in days, she countered with a small smile. Something in her tone, firm but warm, broke through his reserve. He sat down. She ladled the soup into his bowl, the steam rising in little curls, and placed a spoon beside it. He took a tentative sip, and his eyes flickered with surprise. This actually tastes like Vermont, he said slowly. Naomi grinned. It's the time. My grandmother swore it could cure the winter blues. For a while they ate in companionable silence. Naomi broke off a piece of cornbread and buttered it, the scent of warm cornmeal filling the air. Elliot found himself matching her pace, bite for bite. Why did you come to work for me? He asked suddenly. I needed steady work, Naomi replied, her tone neutral. And I liked the idea of working in one place. Less running around, more stability. He studied her. You could have gone back to caregiving. She shook her head. Not after my mother passed? It's hard to go back to something that broke your heart. Her words lingered between them, heavy but not oppressive. Elliot glanced toward the unlit Christmas tree in the corner. You haven't put the lights on, he said. Not my place, she replied. Maybe it should be, he said, and his voice was softer this time. From the far side of the room, the sound of footsteps broke the moment. Monica appeared in the doorway, phone in hand. Sorry to interrupt, she said, though her tone suggested otherwise. Naomi, do you need anything else for the evening? I think we're fine, Naomi said, starting to gather the dishes. I'll help, Elliot offered, already stacking his bowl on top of hers. Monica's eyes narrowed ever so slightly. You're sure you're fine? Because if you're not feeling well, I'm fine, he interrupted. Naomi's cooking seems to be working better than anything 20 doctors could do. Monica gave a tight smile and stepped back into the hallway. As soon as she was out of sight, Naomi glanced at Elliot. She doesn't trust me. She doesn't trust anyone she hasn't run a background check on, he said. Naomi raised an eyebrow. And have you? He smirked faintly. Not yet. Back in the kitchen, Naomi rinsed the bowls, her hands moving automatically under the warm water. You should try to sleep tonight, she said without looking at him. I'll try, he replied, though he didn't sound convinced. Don't try, she said. Just let your body do what it needs to. Elliot watched her for a long moment. What did your grandmother used to say? Naomi dried her hands and turned to face him. That sometimes the cure isn't a pill, it's a person. The words sat between them as tangible as the scent of soup still hanging in the air. Later that evening, the penthouse felt unusually still. The snow outside had thickened into a quiet curtain, muting the usual hum of the city. Elliot sat in the armchair near the window, the glow from a nearby lamp casting soft shadows on his face. Naomi moved through the living room with an ease that felt different, less like an employee, more like someone who belonged. She carried a folded blanket toward him. If you're going to sit here, you might as well be warm, she said, draping it over the arm of the chair. He accepted it without protest, a small but telling shift from the man who had once barked at staff for moving his things. Thanks, he murmured, adjusting it over his lap. Naomi stepped toward the unlit Christmas tree, eyeing the ornaments that had been carefully placed but never enjoyed. Your tree's beautiful, she said, but it feels unfinished without the lights. Elliot followed her gaze. I haven't had the energy to bother. Then let me, she offered. He hesitated, then nodded. She crouched by the outlet, plugging in the string of white lights. One by one they flickered to life, wrapping the tree in a soft golden glow. The reflection shimmered in the window behind it, blending with the falling snow. Something in his chest loosened at the sight. That's better, he admitted quietly. Naomi stepped back satisfied. Sometimes the smallest changes make the biggest difference. They sat in the warm light for a few moments, the only sound the faint crackle from the heating system. Naomi glanced at him, noting how his eyelids seemed heavier than usual. You're fading, she said gently. Go to bed. I might actually listen to you tonight, he replied with the hint of a smile. She grinned. I'll take that as progress. In the kitchen, she tidied up the last of the dinner dishes, humming softly to herself. By the time she returned to the living room, Elliot had already reclined the chair, slightly, his eyes closed. She draped the blanket higher over his chest, then dimmed the lamp. For the first time since she'd started working here, she saw him truly at rest. No laptop, no phone, no clenched jaw, just a man breathing evenly, letting go for a while. Naomi made her way to the guest corridor, where her small room was tucked away. She paused at the doorway, casting one last glance toward the living room. The snow outside the windows was relentless, piling up along the balcony railing. Inside, the only light came from the Christmas tree and the faint spill from the kitchen. She closed her door softly and began her own nighttime routine. Down the hall, Monica's room light was still on. In her suite, Monica sat at her desk, the soft click of her laptop keys filling the silence. A half-empty cup of black coffee steamed beside her. She glanced at the clock, 11:42 p.m., and tapped her nails against the desk. The background search request she'd made earlier in the day still hadn't returned a result. That irritated her. Monica was used to getting what she wanted fast, especially when it came to protecting her employer, or controlling the environment depending on who you asked. Her phone buzzed once, an email notification. She clicked it open without thinking, her eyes scanning the subject line. It was from a contact in a private security firm she'd used before. Her gaze froze. Background report. Naomi Carter. For the first time in weeks, Elliot suggested leaving the penthouse, and he wanted Naomi to come with him. The offer landed between them like an unexpected gift. Naomi, still in her house sweater and jeans, looked up from polishing a row of crystal glasses. You want to go out? Elliot nodded, already slipping into his long wool coat. It's not healthy to stay cooped up, he said. His tone almost casual, but there was an undercurrent of something else, maybe curiosity. You told me once fresh air and human connection are part of healing. I figured I'd take your advice. She blinked in surprise, then smiled. Well, look at that. My advice finally stuck. Don't make me regret it, he said dryly. but the corner of his mouth lifted. 10 minutes later, they were stepping out into the crisp December night. Snow from the previous evening had been plowed to the curbs, but a fine dusting of new flakes swirled under the streetlights. The city's pulse was different this close to Christmas. More music in the air. More people bundled in scarves and mittens. More shop windows glowing with garlands and red bows. They walked side by side toward Central Park, the rhythmic crunch of their boots on the salted sidewalk filling the pauses between conversation. The air smelled faintly of roasting nuts from a vendor on the corner. By the time they reached the south entrance, the park was alive with holiday lights. Beyond the iron gates, Bryant Park's winter village spread out like a snow globe scene, rows of small glass-fronted booths selling ornaments, knit hats, and handmade candles, strings of white bulbs draped over ice-skating rink railings, the faint hum of a Christmas carol drifting from a nearby speaker. "This is more crowded than I remember," Elliot admitted, scanning the milling families and couples. "It's Christmas," Naomi said. "Everyone comes here for the cocoa and the lights, and the ice skating." He glanced toward the rink where kids in puffy coats zipped around clumsily while teenagers skated backwards to show off. The sight seemed to soften him. "I haven't been ice skating since I was a kid." "Same," she replied. "Except I was terrible at it then, and I'd be terrible now. But hot cocoa, that I can still do well." They made their way toward a booth with a hand-painted sign reading "Winter Warmers, Hot Cocoa and Cider." Naomi ordered 2 cocos, paying without hesitation before Elliot could reach for his wallet. He watched her pass the bills and tuck the change in her coat pocket, his brows lifting slightly. "You didn't have to. Consider it my thank you for getting out of the house," she said, "and for trusting me enough to let me drag you into a crowd." They found a spot near a row of benches overlooking the rink. Steam curled from the cocoa cups, carrying the scent of dark chocolate and cinnamon. Naomi cupped hers with both hands, letting the heat sink into her fingers. "When I was little," she began, "my grandmother used to take me to the church Christmas fair. It wasn't anything fancy, just a handful of booths in the parking lot, a few paper lanterns. But she'd always buy me hot chocolate and a knitted scarf from the same lady every year." Elliot took a slow sip, eyes fixed on the skaters. "Sounds peaceful." "It was," she said softly. "We didn't have much, but she made it feel like we had enough." He glanced at her, then really looked as if trying to read the spaces between her words. For a man used to boardroom negotiations and high-stakes deals, he seemed oddly attuned to these small moments. From somewhere in this crowd, a Salvation Army volunteer rang a small silver bell, the rhythmic chime blending with the murmur of voices. Elliot's gaze drifted toward it, but Naomi noticed the way his shoulders had eased, the faint lines around his eyes smoothing. For the first time since she'd met him, he looked unarmored. They strolled past a row of vendor stalls, each one glowing under strings of warm lights. One booth displayed handmade soaps wrapped in plaid paper. Another offered jars of spiced apple jam. Naomi paused at a stall lined with knit scarves in every shade of winter, deep burgundy, forest green, cream, and charcoal gray. A middle-aged woman with a kind smile greeted them. "Everything's hand-knitted. My daughter and I make them ourselves." Naomi's fingers brushed over the soft wool of a charcoal scarf. She held it up to Elliot's coat. "This one matches perfectly." He shook his head slightly. "I don't need—" "You need warmth," she interrupted, a teasing edge in her tone. "And you need to accept gifts without making it a negotiation." The vendor chuckled as Naomi paid for the scarf. Elliot stood still while she looped it gently around his neck, her fingers grazing the edge of his jaw. For a brief moment, neither spoke. The air between them seemed warmer than the cocoa in her hands. "Thank you," he said finally, his voice quieter than the hum of the crowd. They continued toward the center of the winter village, where a towering Christmas tree glittered with gold and silver ornaments. Children posed for photos in front of it, while parents tried to keep them from toppling into the carefully arranged presents at its base. Naomi glanced at Elliot, catching the faintest trace of a smile tugging at his mouth. "I'm starting to think you actually like this." "I'm not hating it," he admitted. "You were right being out here seeing people. It feels lighter." Her smile deepened. "Told you so." They lingered near a stand selling roasted chestnuts, the rich earthy scent drifting into the cold night air. Naomi bought a small paper cone of them, peeling the shells with practiced ease before offering one to Elliot. He accepted it, their fingertips brushing. "You ever do this when you were a kid?" she asked. He shook his head. "No. My parents weren't holiday people. It was all business all the time." "That's a shame," she said. "Holidays are for slowing down, even if the world outside is rushing." For a while they stood together in companionable silence, watching a couple in their 60s lace their fingers and shuffle slowly around the rink, each careful step in sync. Elliot's gaze softened again, as if some old wound was loosening under the lights and music. Across the way, Monica lingered near the edge of the crowd, her phone angled discreetly in their direction. The lens caught Naomi adjusting Elliot's scarf, their heads close together under the glow of the Christmas tree. Monica's expression was unreadable, but her thumb moved quickly over the screen, tapping out a message. "She's working him, just like the others." She hit send, attaching the video before disappearing into the crowd. Naomi didn't notice. She was too busy pointing out a booth selling hand-carved wooden ornaments shaped like snowflakes and reindeer. Elliot followed her lead, hands in his pockets, his breath curling in the cold. "This," he said almost to himself, "feels different." The music from the rink swelled, a medley of old carols with a soft jazz undertone. Elliot and Naomi found a bench just off the main path, where a lamppost cast a pale circle of light on the snow at their feet. People passed by, carrying shopping bags, mittens wrapped around cups of steaming cider. Naomi unwrapped her scarf a little, her cheeks flushed from the cold and the joy in her eyes. "When I was a kid," she began, "my grandma used to bring me to the community Christmas fair. We didn't have much, but she'd save all year to buy me one special ornament. She said a tree without a story isn't a real Christmas tree." Elliot tilted his head. "So every ornament had a story." "Exactly. Even the crooked ones." She smiled at the memory. "She said those were the best. They proved we didn't need perfect to be happy." He studied her face for a long moment, as if committing the words to memory. "You make it sound simple." "It is," Naomi replied softly. "You just have to let it be." They sat there for several minutes, sipping cocoa in comfortable silence. The world seemed to slow down, each snowflake drifting past the lamplight, like it had nowhere else to be. Elliot glanced at the scarf around his neck, tugging it slightly. "This feels different," he murmured, the same words lingering between them like a shared secret. Naomi didn't press for more. She only smiled and looked back toward the rink, watching a group of teenagers race each other in wobbly circles. When they finally decided to head back, the streets were dusted with fresh snow, muffling the usual New York noise. A horse-drawn carriage clopped past the driver, tipping his cap to Naomi as they passed. She returned the gesture, a small warmth blooming in her chest. The doorman greeted them with his usual "Evening, Mr. Harrington," and a nod toward Naomi. Elliot stepped aside to let her enter first, an unspoken acknowledgement of the day they'd shared. Upstairs, Naomi helped him out of his coat, hanging it carefully beside the others. He lingered a moment, as if he wanted to say something, then just gave her a quiet goodnight before heading to his study. Naomi returned to her small room in the service quarters, pulling off her boots and curling up in bed. She thought about the way Elliot had looked under the Christmas lights, less guarded, almost at peace. It was enough to make her forget for a moment the way Monica's eyes had followed them all evening. Meanwhile, Monica was back in her own apartment, reviewing the video she'd taken. She zoomed in on the moment Naomi wrapped the scarf around Elliot, watching his expression shift in a way she hadn't seen in years. She pressed her lips together, debating. Then she composed a new message to her contact in private security. "I need everything you can find on her. Full history." By the time the city fell quiet under its snowy blanket, Monica's request had been acknowledged. A short clipped reply came through. "You'll have it tomorrow." Morning arrived with the muted light of winter seeping through the penthouse windows. Naomi stepped off the service elevator, a grocery tote slung over one shoulder, still smelling faintly of the cinnamon rolls she'd picked up from the bakery on Madison. She was rehearsing in her mind whether to suggest making breakfast for Elliot when she noticed something unusual. The double doors to the main entrance of the penthouse were closed, but Monica was standing right in front of them. Her arms were folded, and in one hand was a thick manila envelope. Naomi slowed her steps. "Monica." "Everything okay?" Monica didn't answer right away. She simply held the envelope out, her expression unreadable. "We need to talk." The thick envelope in Monica's hand felt heavier than the paper. It carried the weight of suspicion. She didn't offer a greeting, only stepped aside just enough for Naomi to enter the penthouse. The quiet of the morning felt oppressive. Even the hum of the heating system seemed subdued under the heavy blanket of snow outside. Naomi set her grocery tote down on the kitchen counter, glancing between Monica's stony face and the envelope. "What's this?" she asked, her voice even. Monica didn't waste time. She laid the envelope flat on the counter, sliding it toward Naomi with a practiced precision that made it feel like an interrogation table. "Your history," Monica said. Figured Elliot deserved to know exactly who's been spending all this quality time with him. Naomi's brows drew together, but she didn't touch the envelope. "If you have something to say it to my face." Monica pulled out a sheaf of papers, printed reports, old clippings, and a few grainy photographs. "2 years ago, you were working as a caregiver for Lawrence Bellamy, real estate magnate. Big name in Palm Beach. His family accused you of taking advantage of your position. There was a lawsuit." Naomi felt the sting of cold memory creep in, though her voice stayed steady. "There was a lawsuit. It was dismissed." "That's one way to frame it," Monica replied, flipping to another page. "Another way is that the family decided it wasn't worth dragging their father's name through court. But it's still a record, and you can't expect me to believe you just happened to land here in Elliot's penthouse by coincidence." The room's stillness made every word sound sharper. Snowplows rumbled faintly on Fifth Avenue below, pushing aside the heavy drifts from the night before. Before Naomi could answer, footsteps sounded from the hallway. Elliot appeared wearing a dark sweater and sweatpants, his hair still mussed from sleep. "What's going on?" His gaze moved from Monica's expression to the documents on the counter. Monica straightened. "I think you should see this, Elliot." She handed him the top page, careful not to let Naomi take it first. He read silently, the tension in his jaw tightening with each line. When he looked up, his eyes locked on Naomi's. "Is this true?" Naomi didn't flinch. "Yes, but it's not the whole story." Elliot gestured toward the living room, away from Monica's watchful stance. Naomi followed, standing near the tall windows where the view of Central Park was a blur of white. "I took care of Mr. Bellamy for almost a year," she began. "He was kind, but his son wasn't. He offered me money, a lot of money, to keep him company after his father passed. I refused. The next week, the accusation started." Elliot's brows furrowed. "So the lawsuit, fabricated," she said plainly. "It was meant to ruin my reputation so I couldn't get another job in private care. But the court threw it out for lack of evidence." "That doesn't mean it didn't hurt." She folded her hands together, a small gesture to keep them from trembling. "I have nothing to hide, Elliot. Not from you." From the kitchen, Monica's voice cut in sharp. "You're a good storyteller, Naomi. I'll give you that." Elliot turned toward her, his tone cooler than the air outside. "And you're crossing a line. You hired someone to dig into her past." "She's living in your home, influencing your decisions," Monica countered. "If I'm crossing a line, it's to keep you safe." Elliot shook his head, glancing down at the papers again. The snow outside continued to fall thicker now, muting the city into near silence. Somewhere in the distance, the faint wail of an ambulance broke the stillness before fading again. Naomi reached for the grocery tote, pulling out a small container. "I brought breakfast," she said softly, as though the simple act might ground the moment. "Oatmeal with frozen berries. It's not much, but it'll keep your energy steady." He didn't answer right away, but when she set the bowl on the coffee table, the warm steam rose into the cold morning air, filling the space between them with the scent of cinnamon and blueberries. Elliot sat down slowly, the papers still in his hand, though his gaze had shifted to the steam curling up from the oatmeal. He picked up the spoon Naomi had set beside it, turning it absently. "You always cook like this?" he asked, his tone quieter now, as if unsure whether to keep pressing or to let the conversation soften. "When I can," Naomi said. She took a seat across from him, her posture straight but not rigid. "It's how my grandmother showed love. Food warmth, simple things that last longer than expensive gifts." Monica leaned against the kitchen doorway, arms crossed, not hiding her disapproval. And I suppose Mr. Bellamy appreciated those simple things, too. Naomi's eyes flicked toward her, but didn't linger. Mr. Bellamy appreciated kindness. His son didn't. Elliot took a bite, chewing slowly. The flavor was subtle, but comforting, soft oats, the tartness of frozen berries melting into sweetness, and just enough cinnamon to remind him of childhood Christmas mornings. You know, he said after swallowing, the doctors have been telling me to eat like this for months. Somehow it feels different coming from you. That's because I'm not writing it on a prescription pad, Naomi replied. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling faintly against the double-pane windows. The sky had turned a pale gray, the kind that promised more snow before the day ended. Down on the street, an Amazon delivery van inched its way between snowbanks, the driver stepping carefully to avoid icy patches. Monica broke the moment with a clipped voice. Elliot, I'm not saying you shouldn't have help around here, but you're trusting someone you barely know, someone with a questionable record. Elliot set the spoon down. And you think hiring a private investigator behind my back was the right move? I think not knowing who she is would be worse, Monica shot back. Naomi stood picking up the empty mug Elliot had left from the night before. If you want me to leave, say it, Elliot. I'm not here to make your life harder. Her calmness made the air heavier. Elliot looked at her for a long moment, the lines of fatigue under his eyes softening just slightly. I don't want you to leave, he said finally. Monica let out a frustrated sigh, but Elliot's gaze stayed fixed on Naomi. If what you told me is true, then you've already been punished for something you didn't do. I'm not adding to that. Naomi gave a small nod, her eyes warm but guarded. Then let's focus on getting you well. For a brief stretch, the apartment settled into a tentative peace. Naomi moved to the kitchen, setting water to boil for tea, the faint scent of ginger and cinnamon beginning to fill the air. Elliot leaned back against the couch cushions, his breathing slow, watching her, as if trying to read between her words and actions. Then, without warning, he pressed a hand to his forehead. I feel lightheaded, he murmured. Naomi was at his side in an instant. Don't try to stand. Just breathe with me. She guided him to shift forward slightly, her hands steady on his shoulders. In through your nose, out through your mouth. Slow. Elliot obeyed, though his eyelids fluttered. The edges of the room blurred for him, but Naomi's voice was steady and close, an anchor. She eased him into a series of slow stretches, helping the blood circulate her movements, practiced from years of caregiving. Monica hovered a few steps away, torn between calling 911 and letting Naomi work. Shouldn't we? Not yet, Naomi said firmly without looking up. His blood pressures dropped, but it's stabilizing. A few minutes passed before Elliot's breathing returned to a more even rhythm. The color in his face warmed slightly, and the tension in his shoulders eased. Better, he whispered. Naomi stepped back, just enough to give him space. You scared me for a second there, she said softly, a faint smile pulling at the corner of her lips. Elliot managed a weak chuckle. Guess I should stop skipping breakfast. Naomi shook her head lightly, though relief flickered in her eyes. She picked up the tea kettle as it whistled, pouring the steaming liquid into a mug and setting it within his reach. Outside, the snow continued to fall, muting the city even further. Somewhere down on the corner, the Salvation Army bell ringer was still at it, a tiny sound barely cutting through the heavy winter quiet. Elliot sipped the tea, slowly letting the heat seep through his fingers. You know, he murmured, it's strange. Every test, every scan says nothing's wrong yet. I feel like my body's shutting down. And then you come along with tea and oatmeal, and somehow it feels lighter. Naomi didn't respond right away. She was standing by the window, watching snowplows push thick ridges of white to the curb. Sometimes the body listens to things science can't measure, she said finally, her voice low. He gave a wry smile. You make it sound almost poetic. It's not poetry, she replied, turning toward him. It's experience. Monica stepped forward, her heels clicking on the hardwood. Experience that hasn't been vetted, Elliot. You've got to understand, people see your bank account before they see you. That's why I did what I did. Elliot's gaze sharpened. There's protecting me, Monica, and then there's crossing lines. You hired someone to dig through her past without telling me. I'd do it again, Monica said without hesitation. I'm not going to stand by and watch you get taken advantage of. Naomi picked up the now empty tea mug, setting it in the sink. If you think I'm here to take advantage of him, then maybe you should be the one to leave, she said quietly. That caught Monica off guard, but her chin lifted. This is his home. I'm not going anywhere. Elliot pushed himself up from the couch. Enough, he said, the weight in his tone halting them both. This isn't about who gets to stay. It's about whether we're going to work together to get me better. The silence that followed was thick, punctuated only by the hum of the heating system. Outside, the snow had begun to fall, in slower, heavier flakes drifting lazily past the tall windows. Naomi broke the tension by moving to the small kitchen island. Eat something else, Elliot, she said gently. Keep your energy up. She sliced a piece of cornbread left from the night before, warming it in the oven. The smell of sweet corn and butter began to fill the space. He took it with a quiet thank you, the simple act of chewing grounding him. Naomi sat nearby, her hands wrapped around her own mug eyes on the snow, but thoughts clearly elsewhere. Monica excused herself with a muttered, "I have calls to make." She disappeared down the hallway toward the guest room she'd been using when staying over. Elliot leaned slightly toward Naomi. "You don't have to keep explaining yourself to her," he said. Naomi's eyes met his. "Maybe not, but people like her, they can do damage without meaning to." He nodded slowly, a flicker of understanding passing between them. "We'll figure it out," he said more to himself than to her. A little later, Naomi gathered her things to run a quick errand, wrapping her scarf around her neck and pulling on gloves. Elliot watched her from the couch, noting how the warmth of her presence seemed to linger even after the door closed behind her. In the quiet that followed, Monica reappeared from the hallway, her phone in hand. She stood at the edge of the living room, looking toward the door Naomi had just left through. Her expression was unreadable, cool, measured. She scrolled through her phone, opened a messaging app, and typed a short line. The faint sound of the sent notification was almost swallowed by the hum of the heater. The city glittered under Christmas Eve lights, but inside Elliot's penthouse, the air was thick with unspoken truths. Outside the tall windows, snow spiraled in slow, mesmerizing patterns, catching the glow of street lamps. Down on Fifth Avenue, couples strolled past department store windows, dressed in gold ribbon and animated reindeer, their breath turning to clouds in the frosty air. Inside, the only light came from the tree in the corner, its ornaments reflecting in the polished hardwood floor. Naomi was seated on the edge of the sofa, a mug of peppermint tea in her hands. Elliot stood by the window, one hand in the pocket of his dark slacks, the other absently turning his wedding ring, which he still hadn't stopped wearing, even though the divorce had been final for years. "You said something a while back," he began, his voice low, almost lost under the distant toll of church bells. "Healing is more than medicine. It's about trust." Naomi looked up, her eyes catching the soft twinkle from the tree lights. "I believe that," she said. "It's not just words." He turned toward her fully now, his expression a mixture of vulnerability and curiosity. "The doctors still can't tell me what's wrong. But when you're here, when you talk to me, when you make me eat something that isn't takeout," he gave a half smile, "I feel better. I don't understand it, but it's real." Naomi's grip tightened on the mug. Sometimes the body follows the mind's lead, and the mind follows the heart's. They shared a long, quiet moment, the kind that doesn't need to be filled with conversation. The hum of the radiator and the faint whistle of wind through the window panes were enough. In the hallway, Monica leaned against the wall, just out of sight, her phone in hand. Her eyes were sharp, calculating. She'd been waiting for the right moment. When she heard Elliot's steps retreat toward the kitchen, she slipped into the living room with a bright, too smooth smile. "Naomi," Monica said warmly, "do you have a second?" Naomi glanced up. "Sure, what's going on?" "I thought, since it's Christmas Eve and all, maybe we could talk. Just us girls." She pulled on her coat. "I've got my car downstairs. It's not far." Naomi hesitated, eyes darting toward the kitchen, where Elliot was rummaging through cabinets. "I should." "It'll only take a few minutes," Monica cut in her tone, coaxing. "I promise." The hesitation lingered, but Naomi finally nodded, setting her mug on the coffee table. "Let me grab my scarf." A few minutes later, they were in the elevator, the mirrored walls reflecting Naomi's knitted hat and Monica's perfectly styled hair. Naomi tried making small talk about the snow and the way New York seemed quieter on Christmas Eve, but Monica's responses were clipped, her attention fixed on her phone. The doorman gave them a cheery, "Merry Christmas, ladies," as they stepped into the lobby. Outside, the cold bit into Naomi's cheeks, her breath visible in the dark. A black SUV idled at the curb, and Monica motioned toward it. Inside the car, the heater blasted warm air, and the city's glow passed in blurs beyond the tinted windows. So Naomi began. "What did you want to talk about?" Monica smiled without warmth. "You'll see." The car turned onto a quieter street away from the glittering avenues, and Naomi felt a small ripple of unease in her chest. She glanced at Monica, whose gaze was fixed straight ahead, jaw set. The SUV rolled past shuttered storefronts and darkened windows, the glow of holiday lights fading into the distance. Naomi kept her hands folded in her lap, her fingers tracing the knitted pattern of her gloves. "Monica," she said after a beat, "this isn't really the direction to any coffee shop I know." "We're not going to a coffee shop," Monica replied, her voice smooth but firm. "I thought it might be better to have our talk somewhere more private." Naomi's gaze shifted to the driver, a broad-shouldered man in a dark cap who kept his eyes on the road. Snowflakes streaked across the windshield, catching in the wiper's sweep before disappearing into the night. They drove for another 10 minutes, the streets growing emptier, the holiday glow giving way to pools of shadow beneath flickering street lamps. Naomi recognized the area. They were near the edge of the bus terminal district, where Greyhound and Megabus lines came and went. The SUV slowed, pulling up alongside the curb near a row of idling buses. A gust of icy air swept in when the driver unlocked the doors. "Out," Monica said simply. Naomi blinked. "What?" "I think it's time for you to take a trip. Anywhere but here." Monica's eyes were unreadable. Her red lips pressed into a thin line. She reached into her bag and pulled out a folded wad of cash, pressing it into Naomi's hand. "This should get you somewhere warmer. Or at least, away from Elliot." Naomi's pulse quickened. "Is this his idea?" "No," Monica said quickly, then added with a hint of satisfaction, "but it's the right thing for him." She leaned closer, lowering her voice. "You're making him dependent on you. He's vulnerable, Naomi. He doesn't need another person taking advantage of that." The words stung not because they were true, but because Naomi had heard similar accusations years ago, back when her name had been dragged through court for a crime she hadn't committed. "I'm not leaving him," Naomi said evenly, trying to keep her voice calm, despite the swirl of emotions rising in her chest. "You are," Monica countered. "One way or another. So make it easy." The driver reached over and opened the passenger side door. Cold air rushed in, carrying the smell of diesel and snow. Naomi stepped out, clutching her scarf tighter around her neck. Behind her, the SUV door shut and the engine revved. She watched the red taillights fade into the snowy darkness until they were gone. The bus terminal loomed ahead, its fluorescent lights buzzing faintly. People milled around travelers, dragging suitcases, a man in a puffy coat shouting into his phone, a security guard sipping coffee from a styrofoam cup. Naomi dug into her coat pocket for her phone and froze. Empty. Her heart sank. The phone must have slipped out in the SUV, or worse, Monica had taken it. She checked her other pocket, then her tote bag. Nothing. The cold was sharper now, seeping through her coat and biting at her fingers. She glanced around, weighing her options. She could try to borrow a phone from someone, but on Christmas Eve, strangers hurried past, faces tucked into scarves, eager to get to wherever they were going. She stepped inside the terminal, greeted by a blast of overheated air that smelled faintly of fried food and cleaning solution. The departures board flickered with names of cities, Philadelphia, Boston, Washington, D.C., each one pulling at her like a whisper. Naomi sank onto a plastic bench, clutching her tote. She could leave. It would be easy. She had enough cash in her pocket to buy a ticket anywhere on that board. No one would know where she'd gone. But the thought of Elliot alone, confused, wondering why she'd vanished, kept her rooted in place. Somewhere in the distance, a bus engine roared to life, the sound echoing off the concrete walls. Naomi pulled her coat tighter and tried to think. She had no phone, no ride, and only the cash Monica had given her. and outside the snow was coming down harder, painting the city in a relentless white. She closed her eyes for a moment, willing herself not to panic. She needed a plan. Back in the penthouse, Elliot stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the snowflakes drift under the golden glow of the streetlights. It had been nearly an hour since Monica left with Naomi, and something in his gut twisted with unease. He told himself they were probably talking in the lobby cafe, maybe running an errand, but Monica hadn't answered his last two calls, and Naomi's phone went straight to voicemail. The Christmas Eve quiet was almost eerie. Even Central Park, usually alive with skaters and strolling couples, looked abandoned under the thickening snow. Elliot turned away from the window and paced the living room, each step echoing off the polished hardwood. When Monica finally returned, the elevator doors slid open with a soft chime. She stepped out alone. "Where's Naomi?" Elliot's voice was low-controlled, but the tension in it was unmistakable. "She needed some time away," Monica said, brushing snow off her coat. "It's for the best, Elliot. She was—" "Where is she?" His tone sharpened. Monica sighed. "I dropped her somewhere she could catch a bus. She'll be fine." A cold wave of anger washed over him. Without a word, he crossed to his desk, tapping the security feed on his laptop. Within seconds, the grainy footage filled the screen, Monica's SUV pulling up to a curb. Naomi stepping out the vehicle, driving away. The timestamp read 20 minutes ago. He rewound the footage, watching the moment again, this time zooming in on Naomi's face, the confusion, the disbelief. His chest tightened. "You had no right," he said, turning to Monica. "None. I had every right," Monica replied, unflinching. "You don't see it yet, but she's dangerous for you. She has a history of—" "Enough." His voice cut through the room like a blade. "If you ever make a decision like that for me again, you're done." He didn't wait for her response. Elliot grabbed his overcoat from the rack, slipped his phone into his pocket, and headed for the elevator. "Where are you going?" Monica called after him. "Out." The elevator doors closed before she could say another word. Outside, the city was hushed beneath the storm. Snowplows rumbled distantly down Fifth Avenue, their orange warning lights flashing through the curtain of white. Elliot pulled his collar high and stepped into the street, the cold biting at his cheeks. He hailed a passing taxi, the tires crunching over the packed snow as it pulled up. Sliding into the back seat, he leaned forward. "Port Authority bus terminal," he told the driver. "Fast as you can." Traffic was sparse, but the storm slowed everything. They crawled past shuttered department stores and darkened cafes, their holiday displays glittering behind locked glass. Elliot's mind raced. What if Naomi had already boarded a bus? What if she'd taken Monica's cash and decided she'd had enough? No, that wasn't Naomi. When they reached the terminal, Elliot shoved a bill at the driver and ran inside. The building was alive with noise announcements blaring over the PA system, the hiss of air brakes, the chatter of travelers, bundled in coats and scarves. He scanned the benches, the ticket counters, the food court. No sign of her. A bus to Philadelphia was boarding at gate 23, another to Boston at gate 15. He checked each line, his heart pounding harder with every empty glance. Then near a vending machine by the far wall, he saw her. Naomi sat hunched on a bench. Her tote bag clutched against her legs, a paper cup of coffee cooling in her hands. Her scarf was dusted with snow, her cheeks flushed from the cold. For a moment, relief flooded him. But before he could move, a crowd passed between them, and when it cleared, she was gone. Elliot pushed through the terminal, scanning every corner, every gate. His pulse thundered in his ears. The thought of losing her, of not knowing where she'd gone, or if she was safe, struck deeper than he'd expected. It wasn't just gratitude for what she'd done for his health. It was something heavier, more urgent. He spotted an exit door ajar, snow swirling in from the street beyond. Without hesitation, he ran toward it, bursting out into the icy night. The snow was falling harder now, blanketing the sidewalks, erasing footprints within minutes. Somewhere out there, Naomi was walking alone with no phone, no real protection from the storm. He didn't care about the cold or the risk of getting sick again. All he knew was that he had to find her. Elliot pulled his coat tighter, scanning the street, and stepped off the curb. The snow crunched beneath his boots as he disappeared into the night, his breath coming in sharp, determined bursts. He would not let her vanish. Not tonight. Elliot ran out into the snowy night, determined to find Naomi before the sun came up. The first light of Christmas morning broke over the city as Elliot spotted a figure huddled on a bench outside the 42nd Street bus terminal. For a heartbeat, he thought his mind was playing tricks on him, some desperate mirage conjured by hours of frantic searching through the city's frozen streets. But then the figure lifted her head slightly, the faintest turn toward the sound of his footsteps crunching over the icy sidewalk. Naomi's eyes, bleary and ringed with fatigue, met his. Even from 20 feet away, he could see the redness from the wind, the trembling in her shoulders under that thin coat. Naomi, he breathed, his voice catching on the syllables. She blinked as though she wasn't sure he was real. Elliot. The word came out raw, half disbelief, half relief. He closed the distance quickly, shrugging off his own thick wool coat and wrapping it around her before she could protest. The sudden warmth made her inhale sharply, and he tightened the lapels against her chest. "You're frozen," he said, his tone sharper than he meant, but it was fear speaking more than anything else. Her hands clutched the coat as if afraid it might be taken away. "How did you find me?" "I didn't stop looking," he said, simply guiding her to her feet. "Now we're going home." The word home seemed to jar her. She glanced back at the terminal's heavy glass doors where tired travelers shuffled in and out, clutching duffel bags and coffee cups. "I thought," she began, but her voice broke, and she shook her head. No, Elliot cut in more firmly now. "Whatever you thought, whatever Monica told you, it ends here. You belong somewhere safe." They walked to the curb where his black limo idled, exhaust curling like white ribbons into the frigid air. The driver, bundled in a navy peacoat, stepped forward to open the door, his expression a mixture of surprise and recognition. Inside, the car's leather seats radiated heat. Elliot helped her settle in, before sliding in beside her. For a few long blocks, neither spoke. The hum of the engine and the faint hiss of the tires over salted pavement filled the silence. Finally, Naomi whispered, "You shouldn't have gone out looking for me. Not in your condition." He gave a short laugh, half humor, half something more fragile. "My condition seems to be improving lately." He turned his head toward her. "You wouldn't know anything about that, would you?" She tried to smile, but her lips trembled too much to form it. "Maybe a little soup, some ginger tea, and someone making sure you sleep at night. That's all." "That's not all," he murmured, and let the words linger in the warm air between them. When they pulled up to the penthouse building, the doorman's eyes widened as he stepped forward to help. "Merry Christmas, Mr. Harrington," Miss Carter, he greeted as if nothing unusual had happened at all. Inside the elevator, Elliot pressed the button for the top floor and leaned back, still keeping one hand over Naomi's. "I have something planned for this morning," he said, his voice quieter now. Her brows furrowed. "Something planned. You'll see." The penthouse smelled of cinnamon and butter the moment they stepped inside. Somewhere in the kitchen, the chef was busy, the faint clatter of pans mixing with the soft strains of Bing Crosby singing White Christmas from a speaker in the corner. Naomi stopped short when she saw the living room. The Christmas tree, which had stood undecorated except for ornaments, was now lit strands of white lights weaving through pine boughs like stars. Beneath it, wrapped packages in silver and gold shimmered in the glow. Several older neighbors from the building, dressed in holiday sweaters, milled about with steaming mugs of cider. The staff housekeeper, doorman off duty, even the maintenance guy were there too. Naomi's gaze darted to Elliot. "What is this?" "Breakfast," he said lightly. "And something else." He guided her into the center of the room. Conversations hushed. Even the music seemed to fade into the background as Elliot cleared his throat. "This is Naomi Carter," he said, his voice steady, though every pair of eyes was now on them. "Some of you may know her as the woman who keeps my place looking far better than I deserve. But what you may not know is that a week ago 20 of the best doctors in New York couldn't tell me why I was fading fast. I couldn't work, couldn't sleep. I was convinced I didn't have much time left." He paused, looking directly at Naomi, and then she walked in with ginger tea, chicken soup, and this ridiculous belief that I could get better. And I did. I am better. No medical report explains it, but I know the truth. A ripple of murmurs passed through the small crowd. Naomi shifted uncomfortably under the attention, but Elliot stepped closer, his voice warming. This morning isn't just about Christmas. It's about giving thanks. Naomi, you didn't just keep me alive. You reminded me what it feels like to be cared for, not as a billionaire, not as some news headline, but as a person. Her eyes shone, and she opened her mouth to respond, but he held up a hand gently. I'm not finished. He reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket and pulled out a thick envelope, much like the one Monica had carried days earlier, but this one carried no suspicion, only gratitude. Inside is the founding paperwork for the Naomi Carter Foundation. It's going to help patients who can't afford care, people who slip through the cracks like I almost did. And I want you, Naomi, as its honorary director. Gasps and applause filled the room. Naomi stared at him, stunned, as he pressed the envelope into her hands. Naomi held the envelope as though it might vanish if she blinked. The weight of it, more symbolic than physical, made her fingers tremble. Elliot, she started, but the words knotted in her throat. You've earned this a dozen times over, he said quietly, leaning just enough that only she could hear. And this is only the beginning. Before she could respond, the chef appeared from the kitchen, announcing breakfast is ready. The warm, rich scent of cinnamon rolls floated through the air, mingling with the buttery aroma of scrambled eggs and the spicy sweetness of hot cider. A long table near the windows was set with red and green linens, each place marked by a folded napkin and a small sprig of holly. Elliot guided Naomi to a chair near the head of the table. She hesitated. This feels a little too much for me, she murmured. It's Christmas morning, he replied simply. No such thing as too much. The guests began to seat themselves. Mr. Davenport, from the 12th floor in his wool cardigan, with a sprig of mistletoe pinned to the lapel. Mrs. Hanley, who had lived in the building since the 70s and wore a brooch shaped like a snowflake. Even the doorman, Frank, who had swapped his uniform for a festive sweater with tiny blinking lights. As plates of food made their way around, conversations bubbled up. Holiday plans, favorite childhood Christmases, the forecast predicting more snow by nightfall. Naomi listened, sipping cider that warmed her all the way down, but every so often she caught Elliot watching her with an expression she couldn't quite name. Gratitude, yes, but something else, something softer. Halfway through the meal, Elliot rose from his seat and tapped his glass with a spoon. I know it's tradition to make toasts at dinner, he began, but I think breakfast deserves one too, especially today. The room quieted, the faint sound of Bing Crosby's croon filling the background. When I woke up this morning, Elliot continued, I realized it was the first Christmas in years I actually looked forward to. And it's because of Naomi. She came into my life when I didn't even know how much I needed someone like her. She's not just the reason I'm standing here. She's the reason I remember what it feels like to be alive. The applause was warm, genuine. Naomi's cheeks flushed, tried to deflect by focusing on the cornbread on her plate, but a few guests leaned over to squeeze her hand or murmur congratulations. After breakfast, Elliot asked everyone to join him in the living room. Snow had begun to fall again outside, drifting lazily past the wide windows. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting a golden glow across the room. He walked over to the Christmas tree, reaching for a small wrapped box. Turning back to Naomi, he held it out. One more gift, he said. She looked from the box to him, hesitating. Elliot, you've already... Open it, he urged. The ribbon came loose easily beneath her fingers, and she lifted the lid. Inside, resting on a bed of crimson velvet, was a gleaming brass key. Naomi's breath caught. What is this? It's for here, Elliot said. Voice low but caring enough for the room to hear. You're home now too, if you want it. For a moment, the only sound was the soft pop of the fireplace and the distant carol from the speakers. Naomi stared at the key, her throat working. I don't know what to say, she whispered. Say yes, he said gently. Tears blurred her vision, spilling over before she could stop them. She reached up to brush them away, but Elliot caught her hand, halfway holding it instead. Yes, she finally managed, her voice breaking on the single word. The room erupted into cheers and clinking mugs. Mrs. Hanley dabbed at her eyes with a napkin, and even Frank the doorman sniffed discreetly. Elliot pulled Naomi into a brief, warm embrace, careful but unyielding. Over her shoulder, He caught Monica's absence like a missing puzzle piece and felt no regret at all. She had been gone since yesterday, her things cleared out without ceremony. There was no space for mistrust here anymore. When they finally drew apart, Naomi laughed shakily. This feels like some kind of dream. Then let's not wake up, Elliot replied. They moved to sit by the fire, the rest of the guests drifting into smaller conversations. Naomi traced the edge of the key in her palm, as though memorizing every ridge. Elliot leaned back in his chair, watching the snow pile higher on the balcony railing outside, feeling for the first time in years that he was exactly where he was supposed to be. The morning lingered in that unhurried way only holidays seemed to allow. After the guests had settled into the living room, Elliot stood and excused himself briefly, disappearing down the hall. Naomi assumed he was making a phone call or tending to some last-minute detail. But when he returned, he was carrying a sleek leather folder embossed with gold lettering. He stopped in front of her and opened it. Inside were crisp documents, the top page bearing the heading, The Naomi Carter Foundation. Naomi's brows knit in confusion. Elliot, what is this? It's real, he said. Incorporated as of this morning. A foundation dedicated to providing care, medical, emotional, and financial for patients who can't afford it. Funded by me. Inspired by you. Her hand flew to her mouth. Elliot, you're listed as the honorary director. You can be involved as much or as little as you want, but your name will always be attached. Every donation, every grant, it'll carry your signature. The room had gone quiet again. Even the clink of mugs had stilled. Mr. Davenport leaned forward slightly, as though unwilling to miss a word. I don't deserve this, Naomi murmured, her voice cracking. You deserve more than I can possibly give, Elliot replied without hesitation. You stepped in when 20 of the best couldn't. You stayed when you had every reason to walk away. And you reminded me that healing isn't just about lab results. Tears welled in her eyes again. She set the folder on the coffee table, then reached for his hand. You know I didn't do it for this. I did it because... She paused, exhaling. Because you mattered to me. Before I even knew why. Elliot's jaw tightened briefly, a flicker of emotion passing through his usually composed features. Then we're even. Because somewhere along the way you started mattering to me more than I thought possible. The conversation dissolved into quiet smiles, shared glances, and the occasional interruption of a guest offering congratulations. Naomi excused herself for a moment to refill her mug with hot cider, her hands still trembling slightly from the rush of it all. Through the tall windows, the city had begun to wake, yellow cabs cutting through slushy intersections, bundled pedestrians making their way toward open churches or family gatherings. Somewhere down the block, a Salvation Army bell chimed steadily. When Naomi returned to her seat by the fire, Elliot was waiting with 2 steaming cinnamon rolls on a plate. Eat, he said, smiling faintly. Doctor's orders. She laughed, the sound light and unforced. You're not a doctor? Close enough, he countered, and for a moment it felt like they'd known each other far longer than these few short weeks. The fire crackled. Snow drifted lazily against the glass. And somewhere in the space between shared silences, something settled, an unspoken acknowledgement that whatever had begun here was not ending anytime soon. Eventually, the guests began to gather their coats, offering hugs and Merry Christmas wishes before stepping back into the snowy morning. Frank promised to check in later. Mrs. Hanley pressed a tin of cookies into Naomi's hands, and Mr. Davenport left a card tucked discreetly on the mantel. When the door closed on the last guest, the penthouse seemed quieter, but somehow fuller at the same time. Elliot crossed the room, stopping in front of Naomi. There's one more thing I need to say, he began, his voice low. Naomi tilted her head, waiting. He reached into his pocket, not for a gift or a paper, but simply to take her hand again. His thumb brushed across her knuckles, a small grounding gesture. You healed me, Naomi, he said, his gaze steady on hers. And not just my body. The snow outside still lay untouched, a quiet white canvas over the city, as if the world itself had paused to honor what had just been found between 2 people. Elliot's strength had returned, but more importantly, so had his faith in others and in himself. It was a reminder that healing often arrives not in grand gestures or medical charts, but in the steady warmth of an open heart. Like a candle glowing in a window on a winter night, kindness has a way of guiding us through the darkest streets. Perhaps somewhere in our own days, there's a chance to offer that same light to someone who needs it most.